Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Are you ready to drift off to sleep? Lean back, close your eyes, and let yourself be carried away by the story. Drift off peacefully. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. Pui papugdu e. Before the first word was written long before the concept of a nation existed. Long before borders were drawn in sand or stone, the land along the Nile was already ancient. The river had carved its path through the northeastern corner of Africa for millions of years before a single human eye witnessed its flooding. By the time the first pharaohs rose to power, the Nile had already shaped the geography, the climate, and the very soul of the civilization that would one day astonish the world. To understand a silent night inside the palace of a pharaoh, one must first understand what that palace was. Not merely a building, but a living statement of cosmic order. The ancient Egyptians called this order Mad, the principle of truth, balance, bandits that held the universe in harmony. The pharaoh was not simply a king. He was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, while he lived, and of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. When he died, every stone placed in a royal wall, every column carved with hieroglyphs, every cedar beam imported from the forests of Lebanon, all of it, I expressed the pharaoh's role as the axis upon which the world turned. The palace, therefore, was never just a home. It was a microcosm of creation itself. The story we explore tonight does not belong to a single pharaoh or a single dynasty. Instead, it journey through time, through the New Kingdom at the height of its glory, through the 18th and 19th dynasties that produced names Lexlak, Mos, Amenhotep, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Tutankhamun, Ramesses, and Nefertari. It is a journey into a single night. A night that might have existed in the palace at the Res, or at Memphis, or at Pi-Ramesses, the great city Ramessesu, built in the eastern delta. A night when the torches burned low, when the guards stood silent at their posts, and when the most powerful man or woman in the known world lay awake beneath linen sheets, listening to the river breathe. This is not fiction dressed as history. Every detail we explore, the architecture, the food, the perfume, the politics, the prayers, the fears, is drawn decades of archaeological excavation from papyrus texts preserved in desert dryness for 3,000 years, from tomb paintings, from tomb corded the daily life with the precision of a documentary camera. The ancient Egyptians left behind one of the most complete records of any civilization in the ancient world. And through those records, we can walk the corridors of a palace that no longer stands and hear echoes of conversations spoken in a language no living person first learned as a child. Close your eyes for a moment. The year is somewhere around 260 BCE. The city of Pi-Ramesses, the house of Ramesses, rises from the eastern delta like a dream carved in stone and gold. The great pharaoh Ramessu, whom the Egyptians called User-Matrisatapanra, the powerful one of Ra, the chosen of Ra, has ruled for more than 3 decades. He has fought at Kadesh, signed the world's first recorded peace treaty, built temples from Nubia to the Delta, and fathered over 100 children. his chief queen, Nefertari, she for whom the sun shines, sleeps in chambers decorated with images of Hathor and Isis. His viziers have retired. His scribes have set down their palettes. His army rests in barracks that stretch beyond the palace walls. And somewhere in the heart of the most magnificent building ever constructed by human hands up to that point in history, a single oil lamp burns. Its flame bends in the night breeze drifting through a window cut from limestone. And the night holds its breath. Let us step inside, chapter on the architecture of heaven on earth. The palace Pyramidus announces itself modestly from the Nile, approaching by boat, as most dignitaries and ambassadors did. The complex appeared first as a horizon of gilded flagpoles, their pennants of red and blue linen catching the afternoon wind. Behind them rose pylons of painted sandstone, their surfaces alive with scenes of the Pharaoh smiting enemies, offering to gods and receiving the divine breath of life. Obelisks flanked the entrance gates, their pyramidion tips sheathed in electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, so that at dawn they blazed like earthbound stars, visible for miles across the flat delta landscape. To walk through the main entrance was to enter a world governed entirely by symbolism. The ancient Egyptians did not design buildings the way modern architects do, beginning and adding aesthetics afterward. For them, form and meaning were inseparable. The orientation of a doorway, the color of a wall, the height of a column, all communicated specific theological statements about the relationship between the human and divine realms. The outer courtyard, known to scholars from texts and excavations as the Court of Appearance, was vast enough to hold thousands of people on ceremonial occasions, the said festival, the New Year celebration, the coronation anniversary. This space, filled with priests, nobles, foreign ambassadors, military officers, and common citizens, granted the rare privilege of witnessing their living God. The floor was paved with limestone slabs fitted so precisely that a blade of papyrus could not slip between them. Along the walls, painted reliefs showed the eternal battle between Egypt and chaos. The Pharaoh, all triumphant, always crowned, always larger than any other figure. A convention of Egyptian art that communicated divine status rather than actual height. Beyond the Court of Appearance lay the colonnade of the festival hall, where columns of lotus or papyrus pies design, sometimes over 20 meters tall, created a forest of stone through which light fell in shifting patterns. The capitals of these columns were painted in the bright mineral pigments the Egyptians extracted from the landscape itself. Malachite green from the Sinai, lapis lazuli blue from Afghanistan, red ochre from the eastern desert, limestone, black from carbon. These colors were not decorative choices. Each had meaning: green for vegetation and rebirth, blue for the primordial waters of creation, red for blood and vitality, white for purity, black for the fertile soil of the Nile flood. Inside the hypostyle halls, the air was always cooler than outside. The thick walls and narrower story windows were designed to maintain a temperature significantly lower than the blistering Egyptian summer. A form of passive climate control that modern architects stills with admiration. The stone held the coolness of night and released it slowly through the day, creating an interior climate that made the palace feel, to visitors from less sophisticated cultures, almost supernaturally comfortable. The royal apartments lay at the heart of the complex, accessible only through a series of guarded gates, narrow corridors, and antechambers designed to ensure that no unauthorized person could approach the living god unannounced. The architecture itself served as security. Corridors turned at angles that prevented a running person from building momentum. Doorways were set at heights that required a practical measure that also reinforced the social hierarchy encoded in every aspect of palace life. The person who did not bow, who did not know to duck, who did not wait for invitation. Such a person was immediately identified as someone who had never been here before. The pharaoh's personal chambers occupied the innermost sanctuary, surrounded by thick walls and separated from the outer palace by gardens. Egyptian royal gardens were extraordinary creations, engineered and landscapes of imported trees, reflected pools, flower beds, and shaded walkways. In the palace gardens at these, excavators have found evidence of sycamore figs, persea trees, pomegranates, lotus pools, date palms, and imported cedar. Perfumed oils were pressed from flowers grown in these gardens. Blue lotus, white lotus, Madonna lily, henna. The scent of a pharaoh's garden was itself a form of power, an assertion that even nature bent to the royal will. At night, the palace gardens became a different kind of place. The pools reflected moonlight. The trees stood as dark shapes against a sky in the pre-industrial ancient world, blazed with stars in a way modern city dwellers never experience. The ancient Egyptians knew their stars with extraordinary precision. They mapped the night sky, not for scientific curiosity alone, because they believed the stars were the souls of the dead, the forms of the gods, the mechanisms by which time itself was measured. The astronomer priests who maintained the temple observatories could calculate the rising of Sirius, which they called Sopdet, to within a day, and that rising marked beginning of the Egyptian New Year and the approaching Nile flood. On a still night in the palace, every educated Egyptian understood, as clearly as they understood the hieroglyphs carved into every wall around them. Orion, whom they called Sahar, was the celestial form of Osiris. The Milky Way was the celestial Nile along which the dead traveled in their solar barks. The circumpolar stars that never set were the imperishable ones, souls that never died. And Ra, the sun god, journeyed through the underworld each night on his sacred bark, battling the serpent Apep before emerging triumphant at dawn to light another day. The palace, then, was not separate from this cosmic drama. It was embedded in it. Its walls were not merely walls, They were the boundary between the human world and the divine one. And the man who slept within them was not merely a man. He was at the point where earth and heaven touched. The architects who built these spaces understood this with a sophistication that sometimes surprise modern observers, who may be tempted to dismiss ancient builders as primitive. They were anything but. The engineers of the New Kingdom calculated load-bearing capacities with a precision that allowed them to place 100-ton stone blocks with millimeter accuracy. They developed hydraulic systems for the management of the Nile flood. They invented the ramp, the lever, the plumb line, and the set square, tools still used by builders today. And they created interior spaces of such beauty that, standing inside the hypostyle hall at Karnak even today, with its ceiling collapsed and its paint faded, a visitor can feel something that transcends simple aesthetic admiration. A sense of awe that has not diminished in 3,000 years. Inside the palace tonight, in the deep hours when the lamps burn low, the architecture, its store itself, seems to breathe. The stone walls radiate the stored heat of the day slowly into the cooler night air. The cedar beams above creak, almost imperceptibly as the temperature drops. The reflecting pool in the inner garden holds the stars in its still surface, an Anchiaron and a night heron. The ancient Egyptians called it the Bennu bird and associated it with the phoenix, with creation itself. Stands at its edge, absolutely motionless, as if it too is participating in some ceremony whose meaning lingers beyond language. This is the palace. This is where our night begins. Chapter 20. The Household of God. Staff servants in sacred order a Pharaoh did not live alone in his palace. The very concept of solitude, as the ancient Egyptians understood it, was almost entirely foreign to royal life. From the moment the Pharaoh's eyes opened at dawn until the moment they closed at night, and even during those hours of sleep, when priests maintained a ceremonial presence near the royal apartments, the Pharaoh was surrounded by a carefully organized community of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people whose lives were devoted entirely to the maintenance, support, and spiritual protection of the living God. The organizational structure of the royal household was one of the most sophisticated administrative systems in the ancient world. At its apex stood the first servant of the king, a title we might loosely translate as chamberlain or chief steward, whose responsibilities encompassed the management of the entire royal household, its food supply, its staff allocation, its ceremonial schedule, its financial accounts, and its physic keep. This was a position of extraordinary power. The first servant had access to the Pharaoh that most officials, including generals and governors, could only dream of. Beneath the first servant worked a hierarchy of specialized officials, the fan-bearers of the right hand of the king, an honorific title indicating proximity to the divine presence, were senior courtiers who attended the Pharaoh during formal appearances. Their fans were not merely decorative. In the intense Egyptian heat, they served a genuine cooling function, and the right to stand beside the Pharaoh with an ostrich feather fan was one of the most coveted distinctions in Egyptian society. Tombs of fan-bearers at Saqqara and the Valley of the Nobles show these officials depicted in full regalia, their titles carved in columns of hieroglyphs that record their service to their sovereign with obvious pride. The body servants, those who dressed the pharaoh, applied his oils and perfumes, maintained his wigs, and attended to his most intimate physical needs, formed a separate category of palace staff, whose access to the royal person was uniquely close and therefore uniquely sensitive. Egyptian texts record titles that translate roughly as he who arranges the king's linen, he who attends the king's mourning, and he who carries the king's sandals. These were not servile roles in the way a modern reader might imagine. To hold such a position was an honor, a mark of extraordinary trust. And these officials often appear in their own tomb inscriptions, boasting of their proximity to the pharaoh in terms that clearly demonstrate they considered it the highest achievement of their lives. The medical staff of the royal household deserves particular attention, because Egyptian medicine, while certainly containing magical and ritual elements, was also surprisingly sophisticated in its empirical observations. The pharaoh's physicians included specialists we would recognize today, those who focused on ophthalmology, on dentistry, a significant concern since dental problems were common, in Egyptian bread, ground between millstones that abraded the teeth over time, on gynecology, on surgery, and on the treatment of trauma injuries from warfare. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the most remarkable medical documents to survive from the ancient world, describes systematic clinical examinations, diagnosis, and prognosis for doses for dozens of conditions with a rationality that would not have place in a medieval European medical text. The royal physicians operated within a framework that not sharply separate medicine from magic. For the Egyptians, illness was often understood as the result of supernatural interference, the anger of a god, the activity of a malevolent spirit, the consequence of a ritual transgression. Treatment, therefore, had both physical and magical dimensions. An herbal remedy might be administered alongside an incantation, and the incantation was important as the herb. This was not superstition in the dismissive sense. It reflected a worldview in which the physical and spiritual realms were not separate but continuous, and in which maintaining health required attention to both dimensions simultaneously. The scribes of the royal household formed another essential category of staff. These were the literate administrators whose work kept the palace functioning as an organization. They managed correspondence, receiving and dispatching letters to governors, generals, foreign rulers, and temple priests throughout the empire. They maintained accounts of food, oil, grain, copper, and linen that flowed through the palace in enormous quantities. They recorded legal proceedings, property transfers, and marriage contracts. They copied religious texts for the library of papyrus scrolls every major Egyptian institution maintained. To be a scribe in ancient Egypt was to occupy a privileged social position. The famous Satire of the Trades, a literary text used to teach young scribes their craft by comparing it favorably to every other profession, describes the scribe as the one who commands all others, while other men toil with their bodies. This was, of course, propaganda designed to motivate students enduring the difficult years of scribal training, but it contained a kernel of truth. Literacy in ancient Egypt was rare enough to confer genuine power, and the scribes who served the Pharaoh directly were men of education and sophistication. The female members of the royal household occupied their own complex hierarchy. The great royal wife, the chief queen, presided over the house of women, sometimes called the harem in scholarly literature, though this term carries connotations from other cultures that can be misleading. The Egyptian institution was more accurately a royal household that included the pharaoh's wives, unmarried daughters, foreign princesses sent as diplomatic gifts, and their attendants. This institution was administered by its own officials, maintained its own economy, and operated as a largely self-contained community within the larger palace complex. Archaeological excavations at Garab, in the Fayum Oasis region, have revealed the remains of a royal household installation that flourished during the 18th and 19th dynasties. Finds from Garab include weaving equipment, cosmetic implements, imported Mycenaean and Cypriot pottery, and administrative documents that give us a vivid picture of the daily life of women in the royal household. They wove fine linen. They produced cosmetics. They raised children, both their own and those assigned to their care. They participated in religious festivals, and they engaged in the politics of court life with an acuity that their male contemporaries apparently found both useful and occasionally alarming. The religious staff of the palace was as elaborate as its administrative staff. Priests' ranks maintained the house shrines to the gods whose protection was invoked for the royal person. These shrines, which would have been present in multiple chambers, held statues of deities, Amun, Har, Ter, Har, Thur, Sekhmet, sent others, that were treated as living presences requiring daily ritual attention. Washing, clothing, feeding with offerings of food and drink, and the burning of incense. The smell of kifi, a compound incense made from 16 ingredients including raisins, wine, myrrh, honey, myrrh, and various aromatic resins, was a constant sensory presence in the palace. Its smoke rising from braziers in a continuous offering to the invisible world that pressed against the visible one on all sides. At night, when most of the palace staff had retired, a skeleton crew remained active. Guards stood every gate. A small number of body servants remained available near the royal apartments. Priests maintained the night office in the palace shrines, singing hymns, burning incense, and performing the rituals that kept divine protection active through the dangerous hours of darkness. Medical staff remained on call, and in the kitchens, remarkable structures in their own right. Preparations for the next day's meals continued through much of the night, because feeding a royal household of hundreds required continuous labor. This was the community into which the Pharaoh, born, in which he was raised, and within which he lived every day of his life. It was, in its way, a form of isolation. Complete enclosure of a person within a social structure so total that genuine privacy was nearly impossible, and genuine intimacy. The simple experience of being with another person as an equal was something that required deliberate effort to achieve. Tonight, as the palace settles into its nighttime rhythms, the community does not disappear. Its beaker becomes quieter, darker, more intimate. The corridors that rang with footsteps during the day are now near silent, but not entirely empty. Somewhere, always, there is movement. A lamp being trimmed, a guard changing his weight from one foot to the other. A priest murmuring a prayer in a language so old that even he may not understand all the words, only the rhythms, the cadences, the sacred sounds that have been the same for 1,000 years. Chapter 3. Evening meal, feast, ritual, and the politics of food. The day ended with a ceremony that was simultaneously a practical necessity and a theological statement. The evening meal. To understand what happened at the Pharaoh's table, we must first shed any modern assumptions about food as a private, informal activity. In ancient Egypt, the act of eating, especially the royal act of eating, was embedded in a web of religious, social, and political meanings, transformed every bite into a ritual gesture. The ancient Egyptians believed that the pharaoh's physical health directly connected to the welfare of the state. Through it, the welfare of the world. A strong, well-fed pharaoh was evidence that the gods were pleased, that Ma'at, cosmic order, was maintained, that the Nile would flood as expected, that the crops would grow, that Egypt would endure. A pharaoh who was visibly unwell, who failed to eat, who lost weight in public view, this was a bad omen, a sign that something in the divine machinery had gone wrong. The royal body was a barometer of cosmic health. Accordingly, feeding the pharaoh was not left to chance or to simple appetite. The meals prepared in the royal kitchens, protocols established over generations, with specific dishes appropriate to specific times of day, specific seasons, and specific festival calendars. The chief of meals, an actual title attested in Egyptian administrative texts, coordinated with the kitchen staff, the palace store managers, the hunters and fishermen who supplied fresh protein, and the bakers and brewers who produced the bread and beer that formed the caloric foundation of even the most elaborate royal diet. The kitchen installations of a major Egyptian palace were industrial in scale. Archaeological evidence from palace sites at Tel El Borg, at Malkata, the palace of Mahanhop at Perthur near Thebes, and at other New Kingdom sites, shows large-scale bread ovens, storage magazines for grain, and foray for wine and oil, and equipment for the butchering and processing of meat. The kitchen staff included bread bakers, beer brewers, pastry makers, roasters, stew makers, butchers, fishmongers, and specialists in the preparation of the elaborate pastries, cakes, sweetmeats that appeared at royal tables. Egyptian bread was not the soft, uniform product we might imagine. It came in dozens of forms: conical loaves, flat rounds, braided shapes, loaves, enriched with fat or sweetened with dates or honey, specialty breads made with emmer wheat or with additions of carob, cumin, or coriander. The technical skill required to manage a wood-fired clay oven, and produce consistent, high-quality bread day after day was considerable, and the Egyptians valued it accordingly. Tomb models from the Middle Kingdom, miniature wooden figurines depicting the activities of daily life, show bread-making scenes with extraordinary detail. Women grinding grain, others mixing dough, others shaping and baking, in an assembly line process that was clearly the result of generations of refined practice. Beer, tahenket in ancient Egyptian, was a dietary staple at every level of Egyptian society. The beer served at the royal table was something quite different from the thick, cloudy, slouty, sour that ordinary workers received as part of their daily rations. Royal beer was produced from selected grain, flavored with spices, and sometimes with dates, and served in ceramic vessels decorated with the cartouches of the Pharaoh. Wine, introduced to Egypt from the Levant during the predynastic period, was available in significant quantities during the New Kingdom, when Egypt's imperial expansion gave it access to the vineyards of Canaan and Syria. The Delta produced wine in areas near the modern city of Alexandria. The menu of the evening meal might include roasted goose, duck, or pigeon. Waterfowl were abundant in the delta marshes and were hunted by specially trained teams using throwing sticks and nets. Fish from the Nile, particularly species like the Nile perch and the tilapia, appeared frequently. Beef was available, but relatively expensive, since cattle required significant land and water to raise. Oxen were saffed and sacrificed at festivals, and their meat distributed as a form of royal generosity. Pork, despite being occasionally depicted in ancient Egyptian contexts, appears to have been less prestigious than other meats and was associated more with class diet. Vegetables were abundant and varied. Leeks, garlic, gladiots, a plant sacred to Minon, the god of fertility, and associated with sexual vigor, a connection the Egyptians apparently considered positive rather than troubling. Celery, cucumber, melon, and various legumes. Fruits included dates, figs, pomegranates, grapes. Increasingly during the New Kingdom as trade products, various imports from Nubia, the Levant, and the Aegean. Honey was the primary sweetener, and Egyptian beekeeping was sophisticated enough to produce large quantities of high-quality honey for both domestic use and export. Oils for cooking came primarily from sesame, linseed, and moringa, though olive oil was imported in significant quantities from the Levant and was prized for its flavor and medicinal properties. Spices and aromatics, cumin, coriander, fenugreek, and various imported flavors from the Indian Ocean trade, gave Egyptian cooking a complexity that may surprise those who imagine ancient food as simple or bland. The evening meal in the royal apartments was served by attendants trained to move with near invisible efficiency. placing dishes and removing them according to a choreography that minimized disturbance, while maximizing the pharaoh's physical comfort. The food was presented on dishes of faience. The Egyptian glass-like material in brilliant blues and greens, or on plates of beaten gold or silver, for the most formal occasions. Drinking vessels ranged from elaborately decorated ceramic cups, golden chalices whose rims were fitted with carnelian lace. Washing the hands before and during a meal was standard practice. The Egyptians did not use forks. Their food was eaten with the fingers, with pieces of bread used as a scoop or platform for wetter preparations. Small finger bowls of water scented with lotus petals were placed within reach. Napkins of fine linen were available. The experience was formal, but not uncomfortable. The Egyptians' elegance, without the stiffness that characterized some other ancient court cultures. Music accompanied the royal evening meal. We know this from tomb paintings that show female musicians playing harps, lutes, double oboes, and clappers at banquet scenes, while female singers performed lyrics that survive in some cases on papyrus. Egyptian music has been partially reconstructed by musicologists using the evidence of instruments found in tombs, homes, harps of various sizes, ivory, lappers, bronze sistrums, and the Nefer lute. And the results suggest a tradition of considerable sophistication, with melodic structures that may have influenced later Greek musical forms. The lyrics that survive from New Kingdom bank songs are remarkable for their combination of pleasure and melancholy. They urge listeners to enjoy the present moment, to eat and love, because life is brief. The dead cannot return. One of the most famous of these songs, known as the Harper's Song, speaks directly to the theme of impermanence. It notes that the tombs of the architects and unwise men been destroyed, while those men themselves are gone as if they never existed. Therefore, the song urges, let us celebrate today, for we do not know what tomorrow brings. This was not simply nihilism or hedonism. It reflected the Egyptian awareness that the pleasures of this world were precious precisely because they were temporary, and that the proper response to mortality was not despair, but a heightened appreciation of the present. At the pharaoh's table, the food represented not just nutrition, but connection. It connected the pharaoh to the agricultural system that his kingdom maintained. Grain stores, the cattle herds, the fishing fleets, the orchards and gardens, all of which existed under his authority and protection. It connected him to the divine through the ritual aspects of eating. The offerings before the meal to the gods, whose blessing had produced the abundance. And it connected him to his household, to the people who had prepared and served this food, and who shared in their own dining halls elsewhere in the palace meal that was a portion of his own. Because the redistribution of food from the royal table to the palace staff was itself a form of political theater, a daily demonstration of the pharaoh's generosity and the abundance that flowed from divine favor. Tonight, as the evening meal draws to its close, the dishes are cleared. The musicians play a final quiet piece and then withdraw. The lamps in the dining room are reduced to a few. Outside, the garden pool reflects the rising moon, and the night heron has been replaced by a different bird. Perhaps owl, whose hooting the Egyptians heard as a kind of greeting between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The Pharaoh does not go immediately to sleep. There are, still, things to be attended to. Chapter 4. The Hour of Accounts. Governance after dark. The ancient Egyptians were among the most enthusiastic record keepers in human history. Their administratives, preserved in the dry climate of the Nile Valley, give us an extraordinary picture of how a complex state managed its affairs. Tax records, census data, labor accounts, legals, depositions, diplomatic correspondence, medical records, astronomical observations, religious ritual instructions, property transfers, wills, contracts, and personal letters. All of these survive in sufficient quantity to allow historians and Egyptologists to reconstruct the administrative life of the pharaonic state with considerable confidence. What this record tells us is that governance in ancient Egypt was, by any standard, a full-time occupation that did not pause at sunset. The pharaoh, at the peak of his administrative function, was simultaneously the head of state, the chief priest of every god in Egypt, the supreme commander of all military forces, the highest judicial authority, and the manager of what might today call the national economy. The redistribution system that collected agricultural surplus and redistributed it as wages, offerings, and welfare. Managing these responsibilities required a bureaucratic apparatus of remarkable sophistication, and that apparatus continued to function through the evening hours. After the evening meal, the pharaoh might receive his vizier, his prime minister and chief executive officer of the kingdom, for a review of the day's most pressing matters. The vizier's office in the new kingdom was one of the most powerful positions in Egypt, occupied by men whose administrative abilities were complemented by political acumen and absolute loyalty to the crown. The duties of the vizier were inscribed in a text known as the duties of the vizier, copies of which appear in the tombs of Rekhmire and other New Kingdom officials. And they make for impressive reading. The vizier received reports from all the governors of Egypt's nomes, its administrative provinces. He managed the legal courts. He supervised the collection of taxes in grain, cattle, linen, copper, and other commodities. He controlled the labor gangs that built public works. He maintained the roads. He received foreign ambassadors in cases where the pharaoh's personal attention was not required. He supervised the granaries, the treasuries, the cattle herds of the state, and the workshops that produced luxury goods for the palace and for distribution as royal gifts. And he did all of this while maintaining meticulous written records, copies of which were kept in the archives of the vizier's office. The treasury, the granary administration, and the temple institutions that served as both religious centers and economic actors. The evening consultation between the pharaoh and his vizier was not a casual conversation. Egyptian administrative culture valued formality and precision. The vizier would present summaries of matters requiring royal decision. Reports from provincial governors about flood conditions or harvest prospects. Requests from toll administrations for grants of land or labor. Dispatches from military commanders in the empire's outlying territories. Appeals from parties in legal disputes who had exhausted the lower courts and brought their cases to the highest authority. The pharaoh's decisions in these matters were, in theory, absolute. He was, after all, a god. But in practice, the pharaoh governed within a system of established precedent, legal convention, and institutional expectation that constrained even the most autocratic royal will, an action that violated the principle of divine order, would delegitimize the pharaoh in the eyes of the priesthood, the military, the nobility, and ultimately the population, whose cooperation his government required. The most successful pharaohs understood that their divine status was a resource that needed careful management, not a license for arbitrary behavior. This does not mean that pharaohs were merely figurehead rulers, constrained by an invisible constitution. Some pharaohs, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Ramesses II, exercised enormous personal initiative in military strategy, building programs, and diplomatic policy. Ramesses II's decision to sign the peace treaty with Hittites after the Battle of Kadesh was a genuinely novel diplomatic act, the first such treaty in recorded history, and required a willingness to accept an outcome that he had initially proclaimed as a victory, but which was, more accurately, a stalemate. The psychological and political sophistication required to make that decision, present it to his population in terms that preserved royal dignity while achieving a pragmatic peace, was considerable. On this particular night, the vizier has brought a report from the eastern frontier. The nature of the specific concern we cannot know. But we can note that during the reign of Ramesses II, the eastern frontier was a constant source of diplomatic and occasionally military concern. The Hittite Empire, headquartered in Anatolia, contested Egyptian control of the Levantine city-states. The Chardin, a seafaring people whose identity has been debated by scholars, raided the Delta coast periodically. Various Canaanite city-states maneuvered between Egyptian and Hittite power with the careful pragmatism of small states caught between empires. The pharaoh listens. He asks questions. He may consult a papyrus document that his scribe holds open at the relevant passage. He may call for a map. The ancient Egyptians produced remarkably sophisticated maps, including one surviving example on papyrus that shows the gold mining region of Wadi Hammamat with geological notations that match modern surveys of the area. He makes a decision, which the scribal official accompanying the vizier records in the rapid cursive script known as hieratic, a shorthand version, hieroglyphs used for administrative purposes. The vizier bows and withdraws. Then come the military dispatches. Egypt maintained a standing army during the new kingdom, a development that marked a significant change from the Middle Kingdom. When military forces were raised and disbanded as needed, the professional army of the New Kingdom included Egyptian infantry, chariot corps, and increasingly from the later 18th dynasty onward, contingents of mercenary soldiers from Nubia, Libya, and the Sheridan Sea peoples who had been captured, absorbed, and transformed from enemies into elite fighters under Egyptian command. The chariot corps deserves special mention as one of the most significant military innovations of the ancient Near East. The horse-drawn chariot, introduced to Egypt by the Hyksos during their occupation of the Delta region in the Second Intermediate Period, became under the New Kingdom the primary strike force of the Egyptian army. Egyptian chariots were lighter and faster Qibla counterparts, Kadesh, a technical advantage. The pharaoh's military architects had apparently calculated carefully. Each chariot carried 2 men, a driver who managed the horses, and a warrior who used composite bows, javelins, or hand weapons against the enemy. The logistics of maintaining an army and an empire required constant attention. The garrison towns strung across the Levant, at Megiddo, at Gaza, at Canaan's major cities, required regular resupply of food, weapons, and replacement personnel. The gold mines of Nubia, which supplied the fabulous wealth that funded Egypt's building programs and diplomatic gifts, required labor gangs, security forces, and supply lines stretching hundreds of kilometers into the desert. The copper mines of Sinai, the quarries of the eastern desert, the cedar forests of Lebanon, all were imperial resources whose management generated a continuous flow of administrative correspondence. It is past midnight now. The vizier has gone. The military advisors have gone. The last lamp in the audience chamber is a single oil lamp whose flame throws long shadows across the painted walls. The pharaoh rises. A pair of soldiers who maintain positions at the entrances to the royal apartments, all hours, come to attention. A body servant appears silently from an antechamber, carrying a fresh linen robe and a basin of water. The administrative night is over. What follows is different. Chapter 5. The pharaoh's body, medicine, cosmetics, and sacred flesh. The body of the pharaoh was not simply a body. It was a theological object, a sacred container, the physical manifestation of divine presence on earth. As such, its maintenance was both a practical medical concern and a religious obligation. And the two mentions were intertwined in a way that reveals much about how the ancient Egyptians understood the relationship between physical and spiritual reality. The daily beauty regimen of the pharaoh was as elaborate as the most demanding modern cosmetic routine, and considerably more fragrant. The ancients were among the most accomplished perfumers in the ancient world, and their cosmetic practices reflected both aesthetic sophistication and a genuine understanding of the skin's needs in a hot, dry climate. The oils and unguents that Egyptian nobles and royals applied to their bodies served the same function as modern moisturizers. protecting the skin from the desiccating effects of the Egyptian sun and wind. Kohl, the black pigment made from galena, a lead ore, or from stibnite, was applied around the eyes in the distinctive elongated style visible in virtually every Egyptian portrait. Modern analysis has confirmed that kohl has genuine medical properties. It reduces ultraviolet light, decreasing eye strain in a bright sun environment. And compounds in galena have demonstrated antimicrobial effects that may have protected against eye infections. A significant concern in a culture where the flies that transmitted rama were abundant. The kohl was applied using a rod dipped in the pigment powder. Cosmetic sets found in Egyptian tombs sometimes include elaborately carved tubes and applicators of ivory, faience, or gilded wood. Henna was used on the hands, feet, and sometimes the hair. Red ochre was applied to lips and cheeks. Eyebrows might be darkened or redrawn with kohl. Wigs, an ubiquitous feature of elite Egyptian appearance, were styled and dressed with beeswax and perfumed oils. The pharaoh's wig collection would have been extensive, ranging from the short, close-fitting wigs of everyday use to the elaborate long wigs worn at ceremonies, to the double crown and other headgear that represented specific divine or royal associations. The preparation of the royal body for sleep was itself a ceremony after the evening's administrative work. With the wastewater running into drainage channels built into the stone floor. Natron, a naturally occurring salt compound found in deposits near the Wadi Natron in the delta, served as soap, with abrasive properties that removed dirt and dead skin. After bathing, the skin would be anointed with a succession of oils and unguents. First a base oil of moringa or sesame, then a more expensive aromatic oil, or an unguent of fat perfumed with myrrh, frankincense, or the compound kifia. The fragrance of an Egyptian royal body at Nadid was distinctive and complex. The perfumed oils were not light or subtle. They were rich, resinous, warm, and persistent. Myrrh, which the Egyptians imported from the land of Punt, a trading partner located somewhere on the Horn of Africa coast, was among the most aromatics. Frankincense, also from Punt and from Arabia, was equally valued. These resins were combined with cedar oil from Lebanon, with lotus flower extract, with the rendered fat of animals, and with various aromatic herbs to produce unguents. Recipes were closely guarded secrets of the priest perfumers who produced them. The medical dimension of the pharaoh's evening preparation was supervised by the royal physician, who might examine the royal person for any signs of illness or injury requiring attention. Egyptian medicine recognized the pulse. They understood that the heart moved blood through the body through a system of vessels. Though they did not understand the circulatory system in modern terms, they diagnosed conditions through physical examination, noting the color of the skin, the appearance of the eyes, the state of the tongue, the presence of fever, and the character of the pulse. They were capable of setting broken bones, treating infected wounds with antimicrobial preparations, some of which we now know to be genuinely effective, performing certain surgical procedures, and managing chronic conditions with herbal preparations. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the longest and most comprehensive medical texts from the ancient world, dating to approximately 550 BCE, records remedies for hundreds of conditions, ranging from crocodile bites and arrow wounds, digestive problems, eye disease, skin conditions, and gynecological concerns. While some of the treatments involve magical incantations and are based on theoretical frameworks we would not today, others show a direct empirical observation of the natural world. The use of willow bark for pain and fever reduction. Willow bark contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin. The use of honey as a wound dressing only has genuine antibacterial properties, and the use of various herbs, whose modern pharmacological analysis has confirmed meaningful biological activity. The teeth of the pharaoh required particular attention, for dental health was a genuine problem in ancient Egypt. Archaeological examination of royal mummies has revealed significant dental wear and decay, particularly in older individuals, and there is evidence that dental pain was a common complaint. Egyptian dentists, yes, they existed, and their titles have been found, worked with tools including drills and probes, and they were capable of constructing fillings using a mineral cement. Whether these treatments were effective by modern standards is debatable, but they genuine attempt to address that caused real suffering. The royal hair, or rather, the royal scalp beneath the wig, also required care. Scalp conditions, including lice, were a common enough problem in the ancient world that numerous Egyptian medic texts include remedies for head lice using botanical compounds, whose efficacy has been partially confirmed by modern parasitological research. The presence of head lice in the hair of mummies, including royal mummies, testifies to the fact that even in the most elaborate hygiene routines could not entirely eliminate these persistent parasites. After the bath, the anointing, the medical check, the preparation of the wig stand for the evening, and the selection of a simpler head covering for sleep. The pharaoh is dressed in a fresh linen sleeping garment. Egyptian linen, produced from the flax plant grown in the delta, could be woven to extraordinary fineness. The finest grades, reserved for royal and divine use, were so sheer that they have been described by scholars as woven air. This linen, white and smooth, was the pharaoh's nighttime companion, the material that touched sacred flesh through the dark hours. The room itself is prepared. The royal chamber at night would have been illuminated by oil lamps, whose wicks were made of linen and whose fuel was castor oil or semi-oil, locally produced. The lamps would be positioned to push and to provide just enough light to navigate the room safely, without wasting expensive fuel. The bed, a wooden frame elevated on carved legs, often in the form of animal legs, lions being particularly common, with a woven leather or papyrus reed base and a mattress of folded linen. was positioned to take advantage of the prevailing breeze from the delta wind that entered through the carefully window. The headrest, the Egyptian pillow, a carved support of wood, ivory, or faience that held the sleeper's head elevated from the mattress surface, was positioned at the bed's head. Egyptian headrests were not the flat, soft objects of modern culture. They were curved supports designed to cradle the neck, keep the head elevated, perhaps for practical reasons of air circulation, and perhaps for symbolic reasons connected to the idea of the horizon, with the sleeper's head representing rising between the two hills of the east. On either side of the royal bed, protective amulets would have been placed. The jedpir, symbol of stability. The Tayat knot, associated with Isis and with divine protection. The scarab, symbol of renewal and the rising sun. Small figurines of Bes, the dwarf god of household protection, often depicted in a fierce mask intended to frighten away evil spirits, were common in royal and elite bedchambers. And Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth and protection, stood guard with her crocodile tail and lion paws in a posture of formidable maternal ferocity. The pharaoh's sleep was not simply rest. It was an event of potential divine significance, because the ancient Egyptians believed that dreams were a medium of communication between the human world and the divine. Royal dreams, in particular, might carry messages from the gods. Prophecies of future events are divine commands. The Sphinx dream stela, erected by Thothmose I stand and still standing between the paws. The Great Sphinx, Agza, records a dream in which young prince, resting in the shade of the Sphinx during a hunting expedition, received a divine promise that if he cleared away the sand that had buried the monument, he would become Pharaoh. Whether or not this dream occurred as described, the political utility of publicizing it provided divine saint sanction for the succession of a prince who may not have been the obvious heir. Dreams were interpreted by specialists known as the learned ones of the House of Life, who consulted manuals of dream interpretation, some of which survive on papyrus, that assigned meanings to specific dream images. To dream of one's teeth falling out, for example, was interpreted as an omen relating to relatives. To dream of looking out a window was a good omen. To dream of sailing a boat in calm water boded well. In rough water, not so well. These interpretive frameworks were not arbitrary, but reflected an accumulated wisdom about the associative logic by which the sleeping mind processed the concerns of waking life. Tonight, in the prepared and perfumed chamber, surrounded by divine protection, the Pharaoh, living God, supreme ruler, embodiment of cosmic order, closes his eyes. The night has only begun. Chapter 6. The priests of the night. Religion without pause sleep may have come to the Pharaoh, but the religious life of the palace never slept, while the living God rested. The priests who maintained the spiritual infrastructure of royal existence continued their work, performing rituals, reciting hymns, burning incense, and tending the divine images housed in the palace shrines in a continuous round of devotion. that paused only with the ani of dawn to understand the racely life of an Egyptian palace at night. We must first understand the Egyptian conception of what a god actually was. The gods of ancient Egypt were not distant, ethereal beings who observed the world from remote heavens. They were present, physically, tangibly present, in the cult images that resided in the innermost sanctuaries of their temples and palace shrines. These images, typically carved from wood or stone and sometimes overlaid with gold, were treated as living beings. Washed each morning, dressed in fresh linen, anointed with oil, offered food and drink, entertained with music, and addressed with prayers that assumed a reciprocal relationship, rather than the one-directional supplication of a lesser religion. This is not to say that the were naive. The more philosophically sophisticated texts from the New Kingdom show a clear understanding that the god did not literally eat the bread that was placed before the cult statue. The spiritual jewel essence of the offering was consumed, while the physical substance was later redistributed among the temple staff. But this understanding did not diminish the sincerity of the ritual or the divine belief that God's presence animated the divine image, and that proper ritual performance maintained the divine energy that protected and sustained the world. In the palace of Pi-Ramesses, the major divine presences would have included A1, king of the gods, the hidden one, patron of the 18th and 19th dynasties, whose great temple at Karnak was the wealthiest institution in Egypt. The cult of Amun had grown so powerful by the New Kingdom that the wealth of his temple rivaled the royal treasury, and the high priest of Amun wielded political influence that occasionally threatened to overshadow the pharaoh himself. A tension that would eventually, under the later and 21st dynasties, lead theocratic period when the high priests ruled Upper Egypt in their own right. Ra, the sun god, specifically in his merged form as Amen-Ra, which combined the supreme positions of both deities, was central to royal theology. The pharaoh, the son of Ra, born of divine parentage, destined to rule the physical world as Ra ruled the heavens. The solar mythology of the daily cycle. Ra's bark traveling across the sky during the day and through the underworld at night was the master template for Egyptian understanding of time, death, and renewal. The pharaoh's own death and resurrection was understood in terms of the solar cycle. He died like the setting sun and was reborn like the rising sun, joining Ra in his eternal journey. Pia, the creator god of Memphis and patron of craftsmen, architects, maintained a significant palace presence, particularly in administrative contexts, where the creation of physical objects, buildings, statues, manufactured goods, required divine sanction. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war, plague, and healing, a powerful combination that reflects the Egyptian understanding of destructive and creative forces as two aspects of a single divine energy, received particular attention from the medical staff of the palace, who saw themselves as working with her powers when they treated illness. Hathor, the great goddess of love, music, beauty, and fertility, sometimes depicted it as a cow, sometimes as a woman with cow's ears and horns holding the solar disk, was a deity of enormous popular appeal whose cult permeated everyday life, as well as the most elaborate royal ceremony. She was patron of the two lands, mother of the Pharaoh, and mistress of the western desert where the dead resided. A rattle-like instrument, shaken during her rituals to produce a sound that was believed to please and calm divine forces. The sound of the sistrum in a palace shrine at night was at once musical and apotropaic, both beautiful and protective. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and the moon, presided over knowledge and record-keeping in a way that made him particularly relevant to the scribal staff. The moon god's night passage across the sky was as associated with Thoth's presence and the palace scribes who worked through the night, copying documents, maintaining accounts, preparing dispatches, might have understood themselves as working under his protection. The night office of the palace priests followed a schedule derived from the division of the night into 12 hours. A division the Egyptians had calculated using the successive rising of certain stars, called decans stars, whose sequence across the sky they charted with extraordinary precision over many generations. The 12 hours of the night were not of equal length by our modern reckoning. They were seasonal hours whose duration varied with the time of year. In summer, the night hours were shorter. In winter, longer. Each hour had its own associated deity or protective spirit. And the priestly hymns sung at each transition point were specific to that hour. The first hour of the night, as the sun god Ra entered the western horizon and began his journey through the underworld, the duet was accompanied by hymns of farewell and protection. The Amduet, the book of what is in the underworld, describes Ra's 12-hour journey through the 12 regions of the duet in extraordinary detail, with the beings he encounters, the spells he must recite, the gates he must pass through, and the transformations he undergoes before emerging, renewed at dawn. This text, found primarily in royal tombs of the New Kingdom, was a kind of theological navigation chart for the journey through the night. And the priests who sang its associated hymns were participating in the cosmic drama of solar renewal. By the third hour of the night, Razbark had passed through the region where the blessed dead lived in a state of provisioned happiness, eating bread, drinking beer, sitting in the shade of trees, engaging in the pleasures they had known in life. This was the Egyptian paradise, not a transcendent spiritual state, but an idealized version of earthly existence, free from pain and poverty, maintained by the ongoing offering rituals performed by the living for their dead. The connection between the living and the dead in Egyptian religion was not one-way street. The dead needed the living to maintain their offerings. The living need the dead to intercede with the gods on their behalf. It was a reciprocal relationship that imposed obligations in both directions. By the 6th hour, midnight, Barker reached the deepest, most dangerous region of the underworld, where the great serpent Apep lurked, coiled in the primordial darkness, waiting to swallow the sun and end the cycle of creation. The battle between Ra and Apep was a nightly event whose outcome determined whether dawn would come. If Apep succeeded, if the rituals performed by the priests failed, if the incantations were not recited correctly, if the gods did not perform their proper roles, the sun would not rise, and the world would return to the formless chaos from which creation had once emerged. This would mythological decoration. For the ancient Egyptians, this was cosmological reality. The battle of Ra and Apep occurred every night, and the priests who formed the night office of the temple and palace shrines understood themselves as participants in that, their rituals contributing to Ra's victory, their voices joining the chorus of divine assistance that ensured the can of the world. The sound of the palace at midnight, a low, rhythmic recitation of ancient words in a register just above silence. The smell, kefi incense rising in blue smoke from the censers that swung on their chains in the palace shrines. The light, the constant, small flame of the oil lamps that burn through the night to represent the divine fire. The solar bark's pilot light moving through the darkness of the duat. And beneath all of it, barely audible, the sound of the Nile. Always the Nile, moving in its course as creation. Older than the first Pharaoh, older than the first god. The river that was Egypt's spine and Egypt's soul. Outside the palace walls, across the city of Pi-Rameses, other lights burned. In the workers' quarters, where bakers made tomorrow's bread. In the stables, where grooms attended the health of the royal hoyle horses. In the armory, where smiths worked by night to By some scholars, at over 300,000 people, it was a planned capital built from scratch by Rameses to establish his power in the strategic region, close to the empire's eastern frontier. Its construction required labor on a scale rivaled the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom. And its completion, gleaming with painted stone, glittering with gold, resounding with the noise of chariot wheels on paved roads, and the cries of merchants in its markets, must have struck visitors from less organized civilizations as something close to a supernatural achievement. In the palace at its heart, the night rolls on. Razbark moves through the 7th, 9th hours of the underworld. The battles are fought and won. The serpent Apep is temporarily defeated. The guards stand at their posts. The priests recite their hymns. The lamps burn, and in the royal chamber, in the blue darkness behind white linen curtains, a king dreams. Chapter Stephen. The great royal wife. Nefertari's night across the palace complex, in chambers decorated with images of Hathor and Isis, in colors still vivid enough to seem freshly painted. The woman who bore the most exalted title available to a female human being in ancient Egypt was also awake. Nefertari Meritmet. Nefertari, beautiful companion, beloved of Davmut. The great royal wife of Rameses II, a woman whose beauty and intelligence were celebrated in her husband's official monuments. with an extravagance that suggests genuine, rather than merely ceremonial affection, lay in her own royal chamber, attended by her own household. While the night moved through its hours above her head, the historical Nefertari is one of the most well-documented queens of ancient Egypt, and yet so much about her remains unknown. We know she was the principal wife of Ramesses II, and that she bore him children. How many is uncertain. We know she was literate, because a letter she wrote to the Hittite queen, Puduepa, survives in the Hittite archives at Hattusa, a remarkable document of female royal correspondence across cultural boundaries, full of formal compliments and diplomatic warmth that suggests a genuine attempt at personal connection between two powerful women. We know she was beautiful, or at least that the artists who decorated her tomb, the Queen of the Zen, represented her as extraordinarily beautiful, with the fine features and composed expression of a woman who has learned to inhabit her dignity as naturally as she inhabits her body. And we know she died before her husband, probably in the middle years of his reign, before he completed the great temple at Obu symbol that bears her image on its fascia in a scale equal to his own, an extraordinary honor, unique in history at that time. The chamber of the great royal wife was its own universe. Her household included ladies-in-waiting drawn from the daughters of the nobility, women who attended her, performed music for her, accompanied her in her ritual duties, and provided the companionship that royal isolation made both necessary and carefully regulated. These ladies were themselves persons of substance and education. They could read and write. They could sing and play instruments. They were versed in the complex ceremonial protocols of the royal household, and they were presumably skilled at the kind of intelligent, careful conversation that a powerful and perceptive queen would expect from those closest to her. The relationship between Nefertari and Pharaoh and Ramesses II, as it emerges from the documentary evidence, seems to have been one of genuine partnership within the severe constraints of their respective divine roles. The two letters that constitute the correspondence between the Egyptian and Hittite queens, Nefertari to Puduhepa and Puduepa to Nefertari, were coordinated with the diplomatic correspondence their husbands, and clearly represent a deliberate royal policy of using female channels to reinforce and humanize the formal political relationship between the two empires. That Nefertari was entrusted with this role, that she was considered capable of conducting correspondence with a foreign queen on matters of state, speaks to a level of political involvement, the involvement that was unusual even by Egyptian standards. The Egyptian queen's official roles were primarily religious. She was the god's wife, title that connected her to Amun and made her a participant in the most sacred rituals of the state religion. She was the mistress of the two lands, a title that paired her with the pharaoh in his role as ruler. She performed ritual duties alongside the pharaoh at major festivals, and her presence at certain ceremonies was theologically required. The rites that renewed the pharaoh's divine power at the said festival, for example, required the participation of the royal female complement. At night, in her own chamber, Nefertari was perhaps more herself than she could be in any other context. The formal restraints of public ritual were relaxed. The carefully composed expression she wore in public, serene, remote, divine, could give way to something more human. Her ladies brought her the small pleasures that the day's ceremonial duties had not allowed: a game of senet, the board game that the Egyptians played with wooden cones, and were so devoted to that they buried senet boards with their dead. A story recited from memory by a narrator who knew the old tales, the adventures of Sinuhe, the cunning of the sailor shipwrecked on the magical island, the conflict between Horus and Set, with all their mix of adventure, moral instruction, and humor. Or simply conversation about the small human concerns, daily life, that even a queen cannot entirely escape. The Senate board, discovered in so many Egyptian tombs of every social class, including the famous gold overlaid board found in Tutankhamun's tomb, was not merely a game, it was a game with an afterlife dimension. Senate means passage, and the board represented the journey of the soul through the underworld, with the pieces representing the soul and the opponents representing the forces that blocked its passage. Playing Senate was simultaneously entertainment and a kind of meditation on mortality and mortality, a light-hearted but genuine engagement with the theme that permeated Egyptian culture at every level. The tales told in Egyptian households at night were equally layered. The story of Sinuhe, tale of an Egyptian official who flees Egypt in the aftermath of the assassination of Pharaoh, lives for years in the Levant, and eventually returns home to die in Egypt, was one of the most beloved narratives of the Middle and New Kingdom, and New Kingdoms used in scribal schools as a model of literary style, and in households as genuinely gripping adventure story. Its themes of exile, longing for home, the supreme value of Egyptian identity, and the mercy of the Pharaoh who welcomes the prodigal home, made it resonant across social classes and across centuries. The story of the shipwrecked sailor, a tale of a mariner cast onto a magical island governed by a giant serpent who comforts him with philosophy and riches before the serpent's island vanishes beneath the sea. Combined adventure narrative with reflections on grief, impermanence, and the proper attitude, life's reversals. The great serpent's final speech: accept what life brings you, equanimity, for nothing lasts. Even this island will vanish, and all you can do is return to your home and be grateful for what you have. Has a wisdom that transcends the specific cultural context and speaks to something universal in human experience. The medical care of the queen was as elaborate as the pharaoh's, with its own team of physicians, its own pharmacopoeia of remedies, its own ritual dimension. Gynecological medicine was a distinct specialty in ancient Egypt, with surviving texts address sinking conception, pregnancy, childbirth, menstrual irregularity, and infertility, with a combination of empirical observation and magical seizure that reflects the dual nature of Egyptian medicine generally. The tests for pregnancy described in Egyptian medical pottery, involving the germination of grain seeds watered with the woman's urine, have been tested by modern researchers and found to produce results that correlate with pregnancy in a statistically meaningful way, suggesting that even the most apparently magical procedures sometimes had an empirical basis that was not recognized as such by their practitioners. The queen's cosmetic routine was parallel to the pharaoh's, but had its own character. The queens of the New Kingdom used color in their cosmetics with what modern analysis of surviving cosmetic containers and residues suggests was considerable sophistication. Different formulations for different occasions, different fragrance profiles for daytime and evening use, different oils for skincare in the dry season versus the wet. Her wig collection was as extensive as his, and her jewelry, the broad collar of gold and semi-precious stones, the bracelets, the anklets, the earrings that became fashionable for Egyptian women during the New Kingdom, were stored in their own workshop, where craftsmen maintained and repaired them. As midnight approaches, Nefertari's household quiets. The ladies have retired to their own sleeping quarters. A few remain close, but at a discreet distance. The queen lies in her bed, elevated, linen-sheeted, headrest carved in the form of a papyrus thicket, and listens to the palace breathe around her. Through the window, she can see a portion of the garden. The lotus pool catches moonlight. The night air carries the smell of flowering jasmine, and, beneath it, the permanent background note of the Nile. That particular smell of water and silt and living things that is unlike any other smell in the world, and that Egyptians who traveled abroad always said they missed with a physical ache. She is both absolutely isolated and never alone. The Paradox of Royal Life. Chapter I. Children of the Palace. The education of future gods somewhere in the palace complex, in the House of Children. A designated wing where the royal offspring were raised, educated, and prepared for their future roles. The night has also settled over young lives whose destinies were already being shaped by the machinery of the most powerful state in the ancient world, the children of Ramesses, who were numerous. Ancient sources suggest he fathered somewhere between 90 and 100 children, a number that reflects not only his multiple lives, but the political utility of royal offspring in a world where marriage alliances were a primary instrument of diplomacy. Sons would be trained as military commanders, minister heirs, and potential heirs to the throne. Daughters would be offered as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers, including after Hittite peace treaty, a Hittite princess who traveled Egypt to become one of Ramesses' secondary wives. The management of this family was itself administrative undertaking of considerable complexity. The education of royal children began early. The children of the pharaoh were educated alongside the children of high officials, foreign princes sent to the Egyptian court as diplomatic hostages or as a gesture of alliance, and carefully selected children of demonstrated intellectual promise from the scribal class. This mixed educational environment served multiple purposes. It created personal bonds between Egypt's future rulers and the children who would one day be their ministers, generals, and allies. It exposed Egyptian royal children to the cultural sophistication that their diverse classmates brought from Nubia, the Levant, and the Aegean. And it gave talented children from a outside family access to the kind of education that could transform their lives. The curriculum of the Egyptian royal school, known as the CAP, was comprehensive by the standards of the ancient world. Reading and writing were the foundation. The child who could not read hieroglyphs and hieratic script was effectively excluded from participation in the administrative and religious life of the state. Writing was taught through the copying of canonical texts, the wisdom literature, the religious hymns, the administrative formulae, and the great narrative poems of Egyptian culture. The letter to a wayward scribe, the satire of the trades, the hymn to the Nile, the maxims of Ptahhotep. These were the standard texts of Egyptian education, repeated generation after generation, until they became part of the mental furniture of every educated Egyptian. Mathematics was taught through practical applications. Calculating volumes of grain, determining the area of a field, working out the quantities of labor required for a construction project. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, one of the most complete mathematical documents to survive from the ancient world, shows that Egyptian mathematics was capable of calculating areas, volumes, and fall relationships with geessives with practical accuracy. Though it operated without the algebraic notation we use today. The Egyptians calculated in unit fractions, 1/2, 1/3, 1/5, etc., and developed specific techniques for handling the awkward combinations that resulted. Their approach to the area of a circle, using formula that amounts to squaring 8/9 of the diameter, gives a value for pi approximately 3.16, which is remarkably close to the actual value and accurate enough for all practical building purposes. Music was part of the curriculum. The children of the palace learned to play the harp, the lute, and the double oboe, and to sing the hymns and ceremonial songs that they would need in their ritual roles as adults. Swimming was taught. Because the Nile was omnipresent, and then the ability to handle oneself in water was impelling for it. It's important and symbolically meaningful in a culture whose mythology was saturated with the imagery of sacred water. Chariot driving and the use of the composite bow were taught to boys destined for military roles. And for the sons of the Pharaoh, this training began in earnest quite young, because the Egyptians understood that military competence was practically necessary and politically important for a ruler. At night, the house of children settled into a domestic routine quite different from the formal ceremonies of the day. The younger children were in bed, their sleeping chambers tended by nurses, whose role was not merely practical, but also protective in a supernatural sense. The nurses of royal children were expected to know protective charms, lullabies, with apotropaic content, and the proper prayers to the deities, who over sleeping children. Bes, the protective household god, ugly and benevolent, with his leopard skin skirt and his feather crown, was a particular patron of children's sleep, and his image appeared in the sleeping chambers of royal children, as naturally as a stuffed animal appears in a modern nursery. The older children, those approaching adolescence, still be awake, studying by lamplight or engaged in the quiet conversation of young people who have been people by privilege, but who have not yet had the particular experience of responsibility that will transform them. The crown prince, if identified, would have his own more intensive preparation, specific texts on the duties of kingship, on the management of the state, on the protocols of religious ceremony, and on the history of the dynasty that he was expected to continue. This preparation was not merely academic. It was as understood as the transmission of a sacred trust, the handing down of a flame that had burned from the time of the first Pharaoh to the present, and that must be passed forward, undimmed, to the generation that followed. The relationship between royal brothers and sisters in the palace was complex in ways that modern observers sometimes find difficult to understand. The Egyptian royal family occasionally practiced sibling marriage, though the extent to which this was actually practiced versus ritually performed is debated among scholars. The institution appears related to the mythology of Osiris and Isis, who were both divine siblings and divine spouses, and to the theological requirement that the king's female complement be of suitably divine blood. The practical political implications: keeping royal bloodlines concentrated, preventing the dilution of the divine heritage into the general aristocracy, were also clearly understood. Whatever the dynamics of sibling relationships in the royal family, they were complicated by the competition for succession that inevitably structured the relationships of princely brothers. The history of the New Kingdom contains episodes, particularly the Amarna period and its aftermath, that suggest these competitions could become dangerously intense. The careful management of royal children's education, the deliberate creation of loyalty bonds through shared experience, and the gradual revelation of who would eventually succeed the pharaoh, all tools by which the palace administration attempted to manage this inherent tension. Tonight, in the children's quarters, the youngest sleep with the absolute abandonment of early childhood, their bodies utterly surrendered to rest. The older ones lie in various states between wakefulness and sleep, their minds processing the complex information of their days. The hieroglyphics they struggled with, the archery lesson that went well, the glimpse of the pharaoh at the evening meal that reminded them, as such glimpses always did, of the immense distance between the ordinary human being and the living God, who was also, somehow, their father. In the nursery wing, a nurse sings softly one of the lullabies that the Egyptians composed, with the same care they brought to their more formal literature. The words are simple, the melody simple, but they carry the weight of many generations of Egyptian mothers and nurses singing the same sounds to the same ears in the same darkness, generation after generation, in a lineage of care that stretches back farther than any royal dynasty. The children sleep. Tomorrow they will continue their education in the craft of being gods. Chapter 90. The army at rest. Warriors in the shadow of empire beyond the palace walls, in the military quarters that flanked the palace complex on its southern and eastern sides, the army of Rameses rested. Though rest in a military installation of the new kingdom was a relative concept that did imply activity. The Egyptian army of the 19th dynasty was a professional force organized, the sophistication that reflected centuries of military evolution, the catastrophic experience of the Hyksos occupation. When an invading force from the Levant, using horses, chariots, and posset bows that the Egyptians of the second intermediate period did not yet pass, had overrun the delta and established a foreign dynasty, had produced a military reformation so fundamental that the 18th dynasty that expelled the Hyksos was simultaneously a restore and Egyptian sovereignty, and the creation of an entirely new kind of Egyptian state. The army of the new kingdom was divided into divisions, each named after a major deity. The division of Amun, the division of Ra, the division of Ptah, the division of Set. Each division can combine arms of infantry, chariotry, and supporting elements, capable of operating independently in the field, while being coordinated with other divisions in major engagements. The Battle of Kadesh, fought in approximate 74 BCE, one of the best documented battles of the ancient world, recorded in both Egyptian and Hittite sources, involved all four of Ramesses' divisions, and the near disaster that occurred when division of Rav walked into a Hittite ambush, while the division of Amun was still establishing its camp, reveals both the complexity of coordinating such large forces and the catastrophic wins when coordination failed. The chariot course, the elite strike force of the Egyptian army, was stationed in specially designed stables within the military quarter. Egyptian chariot horses were among the most carefully bred and maintained animals in the ancient world. We know their names from the records. Ramesses reportedly named his personal chariot horses Victory in Thebes, and Mut is content. The care of these animals, their feeding, grooming, veterinary treatment, and training occupied a substantial portion of the military quarters' resources and manpower. A carried horse that went lame at a moment could mean the difference between victory and death for its rider. The infantry soldiers of the Egyptian army were, by the 19th dynasty, a professional class distinct from the seasonal militia that had characterized older periods of Egyptian military history. They received regular rations, housing in military installations, medical care, and the prospect of reward in the form of land grants, prisoners of war who became servants, and shares of military plunder. The Egyptians kept meticulous records of military service and maintained pension-like arrangements for veterans. Aging soldiers who could no longer fight might be assigned to guard duties at temples or provincial administrative centers. The Sheridan bodyguard, those sea raiders who had been absorbed in the Egyptian military system, occupied a particularly interesting position within the military hierarchy. Distinguished by their distinctive horned helmets and round shields, these warriors appear repeatedly in artistic depictions of Ramesses' campaign, usually close to the pharaoh's chariot, suggesting that they were used as elite personal bodyguards as well as heavy infantry. Their integration into the Egyptian military reflects the pragmatic cosmopolitanism that characterized New Kingdom Egypt at its peak. The willingness to incorporate talented fighters from outside Egypt's borders and transform them through the integrating machinery of Egyptian culture into loyal servants of the pharaoh, Nubian soldiers, particularly the Medjay, who had served Egyptian military interests since the Middle Kingdom, provided police and paramilitary functions as well as combat capability. The Medjay in the New Kingdom had evolved from a specific tribal group into a general term for a type of law enforcement officer, assessing how thoroughly their service had become integrated into Egyptian institutional life. At night, Medjay guards patrolled the palace perimeter, their presence a combination of practical security and symbolic statement about the reach of Egyptian power, and the breadth of the pharaoh's constituency. In the barracks of the military quarter, the soldiers of the night watch made their rounds. Egyptian guards operated in rotating shifts, with the night divided into watches, whose boundaries corresponded to the same 12-hour system that the priests used for their liturgical schedule. The changing of the guard was a ceremony in its own right, with passwords and procedures designed to prevent the imposture that would allow an enemy to infiltrate a military installation by impersonating a guard. Those soldiers not on duty slept in the communal arrangements of military life, an experience that, in any period history, creates its own culture. Soldiers told stories, shared food, developed the particular humor and camaraderie that grow from shared danger and shared discipline. Egyptian military culture had its own literature, accounts of campaigns and victories that blend the factual with the actual, with the legendary hymns of praise to soldier pharaohs who led from the front rather there than the rear, and the particular mythology of the said festival renewal that connected military valor to divine power. The weapons stores stored in the armory, composite bows, bronze, tipped arrows, khepers, swords, the distinctive sickle-shaped weapon that appears on countless reliefs showing the pharaoh smiting enemies, spears, and battle axes, were maintained by a specialized staff of armorer craftsmen who worked day and night to keep the arsenal. Bronze, the primary metal of New Kingdom weapons, required regular sharpening and occasional resmelting and reforging, and the maintenance of thousands of weapons in campaign-ready condition on an ongoing industrial task. The horses slept standing, as horses do, in stalls that represented the cutting edge of ancient animal husbandry. The grooms who attended them through the night were skilled professionals whose knowledge of equine health and behavior was an empirical science developed over generations. A pharaoh's chariot horses received rations of grain, hay, and water in quantities calculated to maintain their peak physical condition, and their veterinary care. Ancient Egyptian texts include a horse management manual known as the Papyrus Kahun, which addresses equine illness with the same combination of empirical observation and magical procedure characterizes Egyptian medicine generally. Was as sophisticated as the tools available to the period allowed. Outside the barracks, beyond the walls of the military quarter, the sound of the city of Pi-Ramses is carried through the night air. The dint bark of a dog, the lowing of cattle in a herder's enclosure, the creak of a water wheel in the canal system that distributed Nile water through the city's irrigation network, the occasional cry of a night bird, and always, the sound of the river itself. The Nile at night was not silent. It moved with a continuous whispered conversation of water on stone, of current encountering sandbar, of a civilization's eternal heartbeat. The soldiers slept. The guards watched. The horses dreamed, if horses dream, and the empire they served and defended continued its nighttime business with the quiet efficiency of a machine designed to run without cessation. Chapter 10. The hour before dawn. When the gods stir, there is an hour before dawn when the darkness seems to deepen rather than lighten. A paradox of perception that may arise from the extreme darkness that precedes the first light, or from the human body's rhythm of deepest sleep, which occurs in the hours just before waking. The ancient Egyptians knew this hour. They named it. They assigned it a specific theological significance and a specific set of rituals designed to manage the dangerous transition between the deepest night and the approaching day. This was the hour when Apep, the serpent of chaos, made his final assault on Ra's bark. The sun god, having navigated the 12 hours of the underworld with the assistance of his divine companions, was approaching the eastern horizon, the moment of vulnerability when he must emerge from the protection of the underworld's chaos and re-enter the open sky, exposed to the full power of the primordial serpent's attack. This was the moment when the battle between order, Twainer, and chaos was most intense, and when human participation through ritual was most urgently required. The priests who had maintained the night office through the dark hours now intensified their activities. The hymns became louder and more urgent. The incense burned more heavily. The divine images were brought from their inner sanctuaries and placed in positions of greater prominence, their eyes painted wide open, always watchful, facing the direction of the eastern horizon where Ra would emerge. Ritual texts were recited that described the defeat of Apep. The serpent bound, speared, dismembered, burned, its pieces scattered so it could not reassemble. These recitations were not mere description but performative speech. The ancient Egyptian concept of Heka, divine speech that accomplished what it described, was central to temple ritual and to magic throughout Egyptian history. The guards in the palace corridors, who had stood their watches through the long night hours, were now at the end of their shift. The coming dawn meant relief, the handover to the day shift, a few hours of sleep before the next duty rotation. Military men of every period, culture know peculiar quality of the last hour of a night watch. The way time seems to both accelerate and slow down simultaneously. The heightened alertness that comes from knowing that relief is coming, the slight dizziness of sustained wakefulness that the coming dawn cure. In the kitchen complex, the tempo of preparation was increasing. The morning meal of the Pharaoh, less elaborate than the evening's feast, but still a ritual event, required fresh bread, already in the ovens since midnight, and a sequence of dishes that the kitchen staff had been preparing through the night. The sound of the kitchens at this hour was particular. The rhythmic slapping of bread dough on flat stones, the crackle of fire in the ovens, the clinking of ceramic vessels being arranged, the low voices of workers communicating in the practiced shorthand of people who have worked the same tasks together for years. The astronomical significance of the pre-dawn hour was understood with precision by the temple priests who doubled as Egypt's astronomers. The hour before sunrise was the time of the heliacal rising of Sirius, the annual event when Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, first became visible on the eastern horizon just before dawn. After a period of invisibility, during which it had been lost in the sun's glare, this heliacal rising, which the Egyptians called the rising of Sopdet, marked the beginning of the Egyptian New Year and predicted, with remarkable accuracy in the Egyptian climate, the onset of the Nile's annual flood. The precision with which the Egyptians tracked the heliacal rising of Sirius speaks to the depth and sophistication of their astronomical tradition. Over many generations, priest astronomers had accumulated records of the stellar calendar with enough accuracy to make predictions that were genuinely reliable. Not exact, but close enough to allow the state apparatus of the flood to be prepared in time. The flood of the Nile, the inundation that deposited the rich silt layer on which Egyptian agriculture depended, was the foundational event of Egyptian civilization, and its prediction was therefore a matter of national importance that the priestly astronomical tradition served with the seriousness it deserved. In the deepest part of the night, just before the horizon began to pale, there was sometimes a moment of absolute stillness. The delta wind that blew during the day and kept the palace cool often died in these last hours of darkness, and in the absence of that wind, the silence was remarkable. Not the silence emptiness, but the silence of fullness, of a world that had been running all night, and was now momentarily paused, gathering itself for the effort of another dawn. In this silence, the palace seemed to breathe. The stones, which had been releasing their stored heat through the night, were at their coolest, and the air held a freshness, the freshness that the coming day would burn away. The lotus pool in the inner garden was motionless, its surface a mirror of fading stars. The papyrus plants along its edge stood absolutely still, their flowering tops catching the faint early light. Not light really, but a lessening of dark. The Pharaoh, if he had slept, might wake in this hour. It was the illogically significant moment of personal vulnerability and personal power simultaneously. Waking in the hour before dawn, The Pharaoh shared Ra's experience of emerging from the underworld, of transitioning from the darkness of sleep. The Egyptians associated sleep with death and morning, waking with resurrection, to the light of consciousness and divine function. The body servants, who were waiting near the royal chamber, would begin their preparations the moment then they heard movement behind the closed doors. If the Pharaoh did not sleep, if the concerns of state or the weight of divine responsibility had him awake through the night, this hour might have a different quality. The particular desolation of the sleepless person watching the darkness begin to break, knowing that the demands of the day will arrive with the light, feeling, perhaps, the full weight of what it means to be the axis of a civilization. The ancient Egyptians had a concept for this weight. They called it the heavy burden of kingship, and their texts acknowledged it directly. The maxims of Pahotep, wisdom literature composed in the Middle Kingdom, but used in education for centuries afterward, describe the duties of leadership as requiring constant attachment, constant judgment, constant management of others. To rule was to serve, paradoxically, to bear the weight, everyone else's needs, while carrying the additional burden of divine responsibility that ordinary mortals were spared. The light was coming now, barely visible. The eastern horizon had shifted from an absolute black to a deep blue-gray that was not quite dawn, but was no longer entirely night. In the temple shrines within the palace, the priests were reciting the final incantations of the night office. The morning hymn, the hymn to the rising sun day, would be sung as the first light broke, greeting Ra's emergence from the underworld with the joy and relief of people who had spent the night ensuring it would happen. The night was ending. Chapter 11, The Dawn Ritual. When a god wakes up dawn in a pharaoh's palace was not a private event. It was a ceremony. One of the most elaborate ceremonies in a civilization that had elevated the ritualization of daily life, a principle of cosmic maintenance. The moment Ra emerged above the eastern horizon was simultaneously a natural event and a theological triumph. A moment when in the visible world and the invisible world lulled in the daily miracle of continued creation. The first act of the palace at dawn was the sounding of the morning signal, likely a percussion instrument, perhaps a drum or a set of clappers, that signaled the change of watch and the beginning of the day's ceremonial program. This sound rippled through the palace complex like a stone dropped in still water, triggering a cascade of activities, guards changing at their posts, kitchen staff moving from preparation to serving, scribes arriving at their offices, priests transitioning from the night office to the morning. In the innermost sanctuary of the palace shrine to Amun, or Ra, or whichever deity was the primary divine presence of this particular palace, the morning ceremony began. The doors of the shrine cabinet that housed the divine image were sealed each night, and each morning with a ritual that reenacted the moment of creation itself. The opening of the lotus flower, the emergence of light from darkness, the beginning of the day's divine activity. The priest who opened the shrine doors did so reciting specific words. making specific gestures, and burning incense, whose smoke preceded the opening, so that the god was welcomed into a perfumed space rather than the stale air of a sealed cabinet. Once the shrine was opened, the statue of the god was greeted, awakened. In theological terms, though the statue had not actually been sleeping, it was removed from the cabinet, placed on a raised surface, and subjected to a morning toilet that mirrored the pharaoh's own. A ceremonial washing, anointing with oil, clothing in fresh linen, the placement of specific items of divine regalia, and the presentation of morning offerings, food, drink, and incense, in quantities that, multiplied by the dozens of shrines in a major temple complex, added up to a significant daily consumption of Egypt's agricultural surplus. The parallel between the morning ritual of the god and the morning ritual of the pharaoh was not coincidental. The divine image and the living pharaoh were conceptually connected. Both housed the divine presence in physical form. Both required morning preparation to be ready for their daily functions, and both were served by specialists whose role was to maintain that preparedness. The connection was made explicit in certain royal texts that described the pharaoh waking in terms identical to those used for the waking of a divine image. For the pharaoh personally, the morning began with the physical preparations we have already described: anointing, dressing, the application of cosmetics, the fitting of the appropriate crown or headdress for the day's first ceremony. The body servants moved with efficiency of long practice, anticipating needs, communicating in the minimal language of people who have worked so closely together that they have developed a shared shorthand. The pharaoh himself might be largely the passive during this preparation, present in his own body while the servants managed its presentation, or actively engaged, issuing instructions, asking questions about the day's schedule, already mentally occupying the official role that the clothing and cosmetics were designed to support. The first official act of the day was typically the recitation of the morning prayer, a personal address to the sun god that it acknowledged the miracle of another sunrise and renewed the pharaoh's covenant with the divine order he embodied. These morning prayers survive in several forms in Egyptian religious literature, ranging from brief invocations to elaborate hymns of considerable poetic sophistication. The great hymn to the Aten, composed during the reign of Akhenaten and attributed by some scholars to the pharaoh himself, is the most famous example, though its specific theological context, the Amarna period's monotheistic experiment, makes it unusual. More typical morning prayers addressed Amon-Ra in the conventional framework. Praising his journey through the underworld and celebrating his emergence into the day. The hymn to the rising sun day, known from multiple New Kingdom temple inscriptions, describes the dawn in terms of startling beauty. The sun rises like a golden hawk, whose wings spread across the horizon. The world awakens to his light. The birds sing. The fish leap in the river. The flowers open their petals. The cattle begin to move in their fields. Human beings reach their arms toward the sky in the gesture of praise, and the pharaoh, who has maintained divine order through the night, now stands at the head of this renewed world, ready to continue the work of creation. The first hour of the official day brought the Pharaoh's initial consultations, a review of the most urgent administrative matters with the first servant and the scribal staff, the overnight dispatches, reports from frontier garrisons, messages from provincial governors, intelligence summaries from Egyptian agents operating in foreign courts would be reviewed and prioritized. Decisions that had been deferred from the previous evening's session would be made. Instructions would be issued for the day's work. Then came the ceremonial commitments of the morning. The inspection of the palace shrines, participation in the morning rituals if the day was a festival day, the reception of petitioners at the great gateway known as the Window of Appearances, where the Pharaoh stood visible to a crowd of officials and commoners who had gathered to see their living God, and, if fortunate, to receive a token of royal recognition, a golden collar draped around their necks by the Pharaoh's own hands, the highest honor a subject could receive in the course of ordinary life. The great morning was the counterpart to the private night. We have explored where the night was intimate, the Pharaoh alone, or nearly alone with his thoughts, his fears, his prayers, his body servants, his vizier, his wife. The morning audience was public, theatrical, carefully choreographed, project the image of divine power that political stability of Egypt required. The Pharaoh who appeared at the Window of Appearances was not showing himself. His enacting the role of living God in a ceremony whose every element, the crowds, the music, the elaborate regalia, the throwing of gold collars, was designed to produce in every observer a specific emotional and theological response. This performance was not false. Egyptian royal ideology was not simply propaganda in the cynical modern sense. The Pharaoh who had spent the night awake with the weight of governance, who had prayed in genuine sincerity to believed were relieved, were real, understood his divine role as a genuine cosmic responsibility rather than a mere political fiction. Such a man, emerging into the morning light to perform his divine function before his people, was not pretending. He was embodying. The distinction matters. As the morning ceremony concluded and the day's full program began, the palace that had been a nocturnal organism of quiet activity transformed into the familiar daytime institution. Crowded, noisy, fragrant with incense and food and animals, and the particular human smell of a large community going about its business. The corridors that had been near silent in the dark hours now rang with the footsteps of scribes and servants, with the voices of officials greeting each other and conducting business, with the occasional sound of hammering from the workshop wing where craftsmen were already at their work. The night was over. The day had begun. Ra rode his bark across the sky, and in the palace the living God moved through his official day with the outward serenity of divinity, carrying within him everything the night had brought. The prayers, the fears, the dreams, the administrative concerns, the human intimacies, the cosmic responsibilities, all folded into the composed, larger-than-life figure that the world knew as the Pharaoh of Egypt. Chapter 12. The Legacy Written in Stone. What endures? 3,000 years after the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, their empire from palaces, they no longer stand, and we are still here, still telling their stories. This is, when you think about it, one of the most extraordinary facts about ancient Egypt. That a civilization which reached its peak over a millennium before the birth of Christ left behind evidence so durable, so legible, and so compelling that it continues to command the attention of the modern world in ways that no other ancient civilization quite matches. The reasons for this durability are both material and cultural. Material. Egypt's climate, particularly in an Upper Egypt, and the desert regions where most tombs were located, is extraordinarily preserving. The same dry heat that made the Nile Valley an uncomfortable place in summer also prevented the decay of organic materials, wood, linen, leather, papyrus, food that would have rotted within years in wetter climates. The result is that we have Egyptian artifacts in a state of preservation that sometimes makes them seem as if they were made recently, rather than 3 millennia ago. The flowers placed in Tutankhamun's coffin, a wreath of cornflowers, olive leaves, and willow, were still recognizable as flowers when Howard Carter opened the innermost coffin in 1922. The ancient Egyptians were compulsive recorders. They wrote on papyrus, on pottery sherds called ostraka, on wooden tablets, on the walls of tombs and temples, on the surfaces of monuments, on the undersides of objects, on the wrappings of mummies. They wrote in hieroglyphs, in hieratic, and later in Demotic and Greek. They wrote everything: administrative accounts, love poems, medical treatises, mathematical exercises, astronomical records, legal deposition, letters home from soldiers on campaign, complaints about corrupt officials, shopping lists, lullabies, and prayers. The quantity of surviving Egyptian text, though representing only a small fraction of what was originally produced, is still overwhelming. Enough to keep generations of scholars busy for generations more. The Palace of Pyramuses, which was the setting for the night we have explored in this narrative, does not survive in the form it once had. Ancient Egypt was a recycling culture. When a building was no longer needed, its stones and materials were reused in new construction. Ramesses III himself was notorious for appropriating the monuments of his predecessors, inscribing his own cartouche over theirs, and claiming their achievements for himself. Later pharaohs and later peoples continued this and the time of the Roman occupation of Egypt in the 1st century BCE, much of Pi-Ramesses had already been dismantled and its stones reused elsewhere, particularly in the nearby city of Tanis. What we know about Pi-Ramesses comes from archaeological excavations conducted over many decades at the site of Tel el-Daba and its surroundings in the eastern delta, and from the enormous quantity of Egyptian texts that describe the city's glory. The Egyptian poem known as the Poem of Pentor, which celebrates Ramesses' role in the Battle of Kadesh and was inscribed on multiple walls across Egypt. Contains a passage describing Pi Ramesses that is almost intoxicating in its enthusiasm. A city where silver and gold are as common as dust, where chariot horses are fine as the wind, where perfumed cedars are shumps and barks, where grain and emmer are stored in mountains, where fish and fowl are abundant beyond counting. This was, of course, propaganda of a very high order, but behind the propagandistic hyperbole was a real city of real people living real lives. Lives that were shaped by the same combination practical necessity and ideological commitment that characterizes all human communities in all periods of history. The artifacts that have survived from this world, the statues, the reliefs, the tomb paintings, the papyrus texts, the mummies themselves, are not simply data points in an academic exercise. They are the residue of individual human lives. The specific hand that painted the image of the Nile god on a palace wall, the specific voice that sang the morning hymn to the rising sun, the specific that worked through the night on the administrative challenge of governing an empire, these individuals are gone. Their names sometimes preserved in inscriptions, more often lost, but their work remains, speaking across the millennia in a language that requires translation but not interpretation. The human reality it communicates is immediate and recognizable. The desire for beauty, the fear of death, the love of family, the ambition for achievement, the hunger for meaning, the Valley of the Queens, where Nefertari's tomb was discovered in 1904 by Ernesto Schiaparelli, contains some of the most beautiful painted walls in the history of art. The images of Nefertari herself, serene, elegant, clothed in transparent linen and golden jewelry, moving through scenes of divine encounter with the poise of a woman who has spent her life learning to inhabit her dignity, were painted by artists whose names we do not know, but whose skill we can. We admire the colors, still vivid in many sections despite 3,000 years and significant humidity damage. Used mineral pigments of extraordinary quality, the blue, the red, the gold, the green. Each was prepared from specific materials by specialist lists and purified them according to formulas passed down generations of craftsmen. The Abu Simbel Temple, which Ramesses dedicated to himself and to Nefertari, was carved directly from the sandstone cliffs of Nubia in a fin engineering
that required the coordination
of thousands of workers over many years. Its 4 colossal statues of the Pharaoh, each over 20 meters tall, seated in the timeless posture of divine power, faced the rising sun, and twice a year, in February and October, dates that appear to be deliberately selected. The rising sun penetrates the full length of the inner temple to illuminate the sanctuary where the divine images of Ramesses, Amun-Ra, and Ra-Horikti are enshrined, while leaving the image of Pa, the god of darkness, in shadow. This astronomical alignment, achieved with millimeter precision in stone, is not an accident. It is a statement about time, about power, about the relationship between the human and the divine. that speaks clearly to anyone who stands at that spot at that moment, even today. The Hittite peace treaty, negotiated after Kadesh, and recorded on silver tablets, whose text was inscribed on the temple walls at Karnak and Abu Simbel, is the oldest peace treaty whose text has survived in its entirety. Reading it today, one is struck simultaneously by its sophistication, its clauses covering extradition of refugees, mutual military assistance, and protocols for royal succession, and by its familiarity, the problems it addresses: how to manage relations between neighboring powers with competing interests, how to establish mechanisms for conflict resolution, how to create the conditions for peaceful coexistence between peoples with different cultural and religious frameworks, are the same problems that international diplomacy addresses today. The solutions the Egyptians and Heth developed in the 13th BCE are not identical to modern solutions, but they are recognizably the same kind of solutions. Negotiated, reciprocal, fliprocal, formally committed, and deliberately public. This is the long night in the Pharaoh's palace ultimately teaches us. Not that the ancient Egyptians were like us in every respect. They were not. Their worldview, their theology, their assumptions about the nature of the cosmos and the human place in it were fundamentally different from our own in ways that matter. But the human things they shared with us, the desire for security in the night, the love of beauty, the fear of chaos, the hunger for meaning, the aspiration to leave something behind that will outlast the brief years of a single life. These things were not different at all when we look at the face of Nefertari in her tomb paintings. The calm, dark eyes, the composed lips, the slight suggestion of a personality beneath divine serenity of the pose. We are looking at a face that belongs to a specific human being who lived in a specific time and place. A woman who wrote letters in her own words to another queen across the mountains. A woman who played senet in the evenings and listened into music, and thought about her children's futures, and felt the night wind from the Nile through her window. A woman who is gone, who has been gone for over 3,000 years, and who is nonetheless, through the evidence she left behind, still somehow present in the world. That presence is not supernatural. It is the ordinary miracle of cultural transmission. The way that human beings, through their art, and their texts, and their physical trace, extend themselves beyond the boundaries of their own lifetimes. The ancient Egyptians understood this explicitly. They called it the K, the vital force that persisted after death if properly maintained through ritual and through memory. This lived as long as the name was spoken, as long as was the ain, as long as the offerings were made. To speak the name of the dead was to give them life. So we speak their names: Rameses, Nefertari, Thutmose, Hatshepsut, Amenhotep, Akhenaten, Nefertiti. To Denkaman we speak them across 3,000 years, and something not supernatural but real is sustained. The connection between the human beings who lived and the human beings who remember them. The thread of culture that makes us inheritors of everything they built and created. Even though we share no blood with them, speak no language they spoke, worship no gods they worshipped. The palace of Pyraneses is gone. Its stones were taken. Its painted walls have crumbled. Its cedar beams have rotted. Its golden throne, its faience floor tiles, its poles and pools and libraries and kitchens. All of it has returned to the earth from which it came, even the mummies of the pharaohs who slept in those magnificent chambers have been unwrapped, examined, and placed in museum cases far from the valley they wished to inhabit forever. But the night persists. Not the specific night we have explored that is gone as surely as every other moment in time, but the quality of that night, the essential human experience of darkness and wonder and fear and prayer and love and governance and beauty and the slow rotation of stars above a world still finding its way, that persists in us because we carry it, because the human experience of being at night a white in a world full of mystery did not begin with the pharaohs and will not end with us. We are all, in some sense, lying in the palace. The torches burn low. The priests recite their ancient words. The stars move in their courses overhead. The river breeds in the darkness. And somewhere between sleep and waking, in the space that the Egyptians understood as the most fertile ground for divine communication, something whispers. Pay attention. This is the world. It was here before you, and it will be hereafter. But tonight, right now, in this moment of still darkness before the dawn, it is yours. The sun is coming. The night must end. Razbark moves toward the eastern horizon, and all the gods who have been guarding the darkness prepare to make way for the light. The pharaoh stirs. The priests begin the dawn hymn. The kitchen fires are bright. The guards wake their reliefs with quiet words. The horses in the stables shake their manes and begin the morning sounds of hunger and readiness. And the world turns, as it has always turned, from the darkness into the light, and begins again. Epilogue, the eternal Nile, the Nile still flows. This is perhaps the most remarkable single fibble about the civilization we have spent this night exploring. Everything else about ancient Egypt, its language, its religion, its political system, its art, its architecture, has changed beyond recognition, absorbed into the long story of human cultural transformation. The Arabic language spoken by Egyptians today is descended from the tongue of 7th century Arabian conquerors, not from the ancient Egyptian language that is related distantly to the Berber languages of North Africa and the Semitic languages of the ancient Near East. The Islamic faith practiced by the vast majority of modern Egyptians would have been entirely incomprehensible to the people we have been visiting tonight. The nation of Egypt, its borders, its government, its relationship with its neighbors, is a political entity that would not be recognized by Rasmus II, who understood the world in terms of Egypt versus everything else. And yet the Nile flows. Every year, the river still rises and falls, still carries the memory of the floods that posited the black silt that the ancient Egyptians called Kemet. The black land, the fertile land, the name they gave to their own country. The Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970, Panaminti has fundamentally altered the river's behavior, eliminating the annual flood that was the foundation of ancient Egyptian civilization, creating Lake Nasser behind its wall, and transforming the agricultural system of the Nile Valley. The ancient Egypt we have been visiting was literally built on the flood, and that flood no longer comes. But the river itself comes. The water that fills the Nile today fell as rain over the Ethiopian highlands that feed the Blue Nile. The same highland rain that has always fed the river. The same hydrical cycle that was operating when the first Pharaoh united the two lands in 3100 BCE. The atoms of water that flowed past Luxor today may have flowed past the palace of Amenhotep III, may have been drunk by the horses of Ramesses, may have been then the water used to bathe the divine images in the temple of Amun at Karnak 3,000 years ago. This continuity is not mystical. It is geological, hydrological, physical, but it points to something that the ancient Egyptians understood with a clarity that we sometimes miss. The world is very old, and we are very temporary in it. And the things that will outlast us, the rivers, the mountains, the stars, were here before us and teach us something about permanence that no human institution can quite achieve. The Egyptians were not naive about impermanence. Their literature is full of meditations on the brevity of life, the inevitability of death, the eventual destruction of even the greatest monuments, the tombs they built for their eternal habitation, the pyramids, the rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings, the mortuaries, temples along the Nile's western bank, were built with the explicit understanding that they were designed to last forever, while simultaneously carrying the implicit acknowledgement which surfaces in their poetry and philosophical texts that nothing made by human hands actually does. What lasts is not the stone. Lasts is the idea that the stone embodies, the idea that the world can be beautiful, that human beings can create beauty deliberately, that the darkness of night can be faced with ritual and prayer and intelligence and love, that the responsibilities of leadership are real and heavy and must be carried with integrity, that the living and the dead connected by the thread of memory and love and obligation, that the sun will rise again. These ideas did not originate with the ancient Egyptians. They predate any named civilization. But the Egyptians gave them a form, in stone, in paint, in the curved signs of hieroglyphs, in the rhythms of their poetry, and the structures of their temples, that has proven extraordinarily durable. So durable that we can visit them tonight, these 3,000 years after their creation, and still lies in them something that we ourselves know. The hieroglyphs that cover the walls of Egyptian temples were deciphered by Jean-François Champollion in Naintoilien in 1922, using the Rosetta Stone as his key. Before that decipherment, the images carved on those walls were beautiful, but opaque. People could see that they meant something. Not. After Champollion, the walls began to speak, the words that had been silent for over 1,000 years. Since the last person who could read hieroglyphics died sometime in the 4th or 5th century CE, began to be heard again. What they said surprised people expected the voice of ancient wisdom to be solemn, abstract, and august. Some of it solemn and august. But much of it was immediately, recognizably human in a way that transcended the centuries. A scribe complaining that his students were lazy, a soldier writing home to his mother to say he was alive and well, a husband praising his wife's beauty in terms that would not be out of place in a contemporary love poem, a child practicing her letters and getting them wrong, a farmer appealing to a god for rain, a queen writing to a foreign ruler about the importance of friendship between their countries. The night we have spent in the palace has been, ultimately, about this recognition. Not the exotic differences between ancient Egyptian civilization and our own, though those differences are real and important and worth understanding on their own terms, but the recognition that runs underneath the differences. The recognition of a shared humanity across the enormous distance of time. Tonight, in a palace that no longer stands, on the banks of a river that still flows, in a civilization whose language no living person first heard as a child, a man and a woman lay in their beds and faced the darkness. They prayed to gods whose names we know, but whose presence felt more immediately than we can easily imagine. They worried about their children's futures and their empire's security and the health of their bodies and the coming of the dawn. They were surrounded by people whose lives were devoted to their service and whose own lives were therefore shaped in every daily detail by the proximity to power and divinity that their positions granted, and they were, underneath the divinity and the power and the ritual and the kagold and the golem, recognizably, undeniably human, with all that entails. The dawn is coming. The night is almost over. The priests are singing the final verse of the night hymn, and the eastern horizon is beginning to glow with the first gesture of the light that Egyptians called the morning star of Ra. In a few minutes, the sun will rise, and with it, the day, with all its ceremony and responsibility and beauty and noise and life. But for one more moment, let us remain here in the darkness that is almost dawn, in this place between night and day that the Egyptians called the horizon Akit, where the opposites meet and where creation happens. Let us listen one more time to the sound of the palace breathing, to the river speaking, to the stars completing their final arc across the sky bore the light, them. Let us remember that we were here, that we walked its corridors, breathed this air, heard these prayers, felt this darkness, and let us carry that remembrance forward into the day, into our own lives, our own times, as a reminder of how long the human story is, and how much of it we share with people who lived 3,000 years before us, and how much more we might share with people who will live 3,000 years after. The sun rises, Egypt endures. The night is over,